Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another expression series. My name is Fatma Dosari, the Executive Director of the Qatar America Institute for Culture, or QAIC. We are a Washington, D.C. nonprofit organization that is focused on art and culture from Qatar, the United States, and the Arab and Islamic worlds. Today, we welcome another expert and a creative who was inspired by the Arab and Islamic worlds and whose career has been influenced by that inspiration. I would like to welcome our viewers from Qatar, from the United States and the world, especially the Hoyas and the CCTers who are joining us today. And I would like again to welcome our guest, who is Professor J.R. Osborn. Professor Osborn is a scholar and experimentalist of communication. His work explores media history, semiotics, communication technologies, and design aesthetics with a regional focus on the Middle East and Africa. Professor Osborn joined the Georgetown faculty in 2010. So happy anniversary, Professor. You've been now there for 10 years. And currently is an Associate Professor of Communication, Culture, and Technology program, CCT, in the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. And he's also the co-director of Technology Design Studio at Georgetown University. And of course, today we're focusing on one of Professor Osborn's amazing books, Letters of Light, Arabic Script and Calligraphy, Print and Digital Design. This book won the 2018 British Kuwait Friendship Society Book Prize and received an honorable mention for the 2018 Albert Hourani Book Award from the Middle East Studies Association, or MISA. The book follows the story of Arabic script and technology from the advent of calligraphic tradition through the implementation of the Unicode standard. So today we will take our viewers in about an hour to explore Arabic script with Professor Osborn. And I would like to encourage our viewers, if you have any questions, we're really excited to hear them. You can add them on the chat box. And from here to Professor Osborn, we're really excited to hear your presentation today.
Well, thank you very much, Fatima. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for the Qatar America Institute for Culture for this opportunity to discuss my work. And thank you for all who are attending today. I'll speak for a little bit, and then I'm very excited to look at get into questions and answers afterwards. So we begin. I'll share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see this. So yeah, my name is J.R. Osborn. I'm a professor at Georgetown University. Thank you very much for attending. The remarks that I will give today are based upon my book that Fatima mentioned, Letters of Light, Arabic Script and Calligraphy, Print and Digital Design. The book was published in 2017, and the book, as Fatima mentioned, is a history. It's about 1,000-year history, and it's kind of punctuated by these three moments. The formation of calligraphy, or development of proportioned script, what we now call Arabic calligraphy, around the 10th century, then the arrival of movable type printing in the 15th century, and then the rise of computers, and specifically how Arabic interfaces with now Unicode standard, the global text encoding standard, in the 20th century. So the book was punctuated in these three periods, these three different periods, and it's organized historically. Today, I'm going to also talk about three things, but I'm going to talk about three different concepts. I teach in the Georgetown University Program in Communication, Culture, and Technology, which Fatima is a graduate of, so congratulations, Fatima. And I'm going to relate Arabic script to these three terms. I often get asked, what does your research on Arabic script have to do with communication, culture, and technology? How does it interface with those three terms? And in order to do that, I'm going to look at three different communities of practice who use Arabic script in different ways: classical or traditional calligraphers, graphic designers, and contemporary artists. And I often use the metaphor that writing and Arabic script, and as well as letters of Latin letters of other alphabets, Chinese characters, are exactly that. They're characters. And like any other characters, they adopt different uniforms depending on the roles they need to play. So classical calligraphers, graphic designers, and contemporary artists all employ Arabic script, but they appear differently and they utilize those characters in very different ways. So just a really quick overview of these three groups. Start with calligraphy. Calligraphy is much more, especially Arabic calligraphy, is much more than just beautiful writing. There actually are a number of very specific scripts that are proportional scripts. They have set proportions and a very specific way to write them. And they're distinguishable by their shapes and visually distinguishable, much like fonts are different for us on digital computers. Here we see, for example, the meme, sometimes it's filled, sometimes it's open. Here, ra is pointy, here it's more loopy. These are noticeable and repeatable differences. So these scripts then are used by calligraphers to develop compositions in which they play among different scripts. This is an Ottoman decorative loha panel. Here's another example in the Ottoman style for master calligraphy Mohammad Zakaria, who lives here in the Washington, D.C. area. This was designed in the early 21st century. And we see that there are multiple scripts. These are more pointy, these are a bit more loopy, depending on the area of the panel. The result is a pattern of writing and design that spills across the page as a whole. Mohammad Zakaria himself calls this non-vocality or non-focality, or a texture in which the viewer may touch the piece, but the viewer is also touched by the piece. And the reader reads it by going between these different scripts and the balance on the page. So moving into graphic designers, they also start at the level of the individual letter. They design fonts. This is a font designed by Ahmad Humayed in 1996, which he made actually by taking the Latin font Helvetica Nero and breaking it apart and rearranging it to make it into more Arabic forms. Here's a more recent font, Fresco Arabic, that was designed by Fred Smears and Laura Assad Khoury. And we can see that fonts are distinguished by repetition again of the way that the terminals end, and certain pieces that repeat to keep a consistent look to the font. This font was designed by the Typographic Matchmaking Project to be available in both Latin letters and Arabic letters. These letters are also used to design compositions, such as web pages. This is the Arabic language homepage of Georgetown University in Qatar, GUQ. And fonts are again employed to make all sorts of compositions, from web pages to journalistic articles to advertisements. This is the sign in a mall, I believe in Dubai, of Giorgio Armani. We can see that the I here is actually the same shape, the exact same character, playing different roles, even though these are different scripts and different languages. So that there's a role here for the way characters operate in international and global branding. And the third group is contemporary artists. And here I'll show a few examples. This is a painting, a mixed media painting by Wijdan, a Jordanian artist who actually coined the term, she's also an art historian, contemporary calligraphic art, to discuss this trend among contemporary Arab and Islamic artists who use letter forms, Arabic letter forms in their artworks. So here's another example from a Jordanian artist, Yasser Dweik, who I was able to interview in 2005. And Dweik, I'll quote him talking about this piece. He says, "I like the movement of the letters. I like the shapes between the letters, the spaces, but I do not deal with the sentence or what it means, or the letters and what it means. The letter itself has an aesthetic form or aesthetic shape, and I play with the aesthetics in that movement." So he's working with the letter as a form, not necessarily as a message. Here's a final example by Sabah Arbili, To Know One Another. This was made in 2011. And I'll mention that the QAIC had a similar expressions discussion as we're having today with Sabah Arbili on December 11th. That expressions talk is available online, and I encourage everyone to go and watch that as well. The Institute is also organizing a show of Arbili's work, both a virtual show that you'll be able to see online, as well as for those in the DC area, a physical show with social distancing that you can make appointments to see. So I encourage everyone who's able to both look at the exhibit online or in person. And I'll give a quote from Arbili as well, from an interview he gave. In modern designs, the shape of the letter can be developed whatever way you wish to take it as an artist. This practice differs from traditional calligraphy. This is the important part. This practice differs from traditional calligraphy, which is a practice skill and requires more articulation of the letter. As I said, traditional calligraphy has very specific scripts and that they're followed in a proportional manner. So there we have our three examples of traditional calligraphy, graphic design, and contemporary calligraphic art. If we go back to the triangle I began with, we can now start to find relations between these. And we see that how I designed this, there's a few places where these triangles connect. And then there are a few places where they're unique in their creation. And if we start to draw lines between those corners, we get axes or kind of a field of ways that we can discuss different types of writing across these three groups of practice. So let's start with this one. And in this, you can see that I have suggested that classical calligraphers and graphic designers both create legible forms, and I've opposed that to the aesthetic forms of contemporary artists. What do I mean by that? Well, here, these are the legible forms. And this is the first of the three terms in the program I work with, communication, culture, and technology. So these are questions of communication. How are these forms communicating? And both of these forms, both the traditional calligraphy and the graphic design, are meant to be read. This form, as stylized and aesthetic as it is, there are passages. Here's the Basmala. There's passages from the Quran. This is the Hilya. It celebrates qualities and characters and traits of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And this also, the graphic design letters are meant to be read on web pages or in journal articles or newspaper articles or as advertisement. So they're meant to be read as writing. The contemporary calligraphic art, on the other hand, communicates in a different way. It communicates visually through shape, color, design. To quote Arbili again, this is a quote, "It is not necessary to understand Arabic to enjoy my work. I try to make my work look beautiful and as creative as possible to attract an audience who can interpret what they want to see within the image." So the communication is there, but it's an image communication and it's visual. So that is the first of our three axes or three forms, comparisons. If we do this one from contemporary messages and classical messages, we also see there's a difference between the way that these groups are using Arabic script. Both graphic designers and contemporary calligraphic art are producing contemporary messages. They're responding to the globalized society in which we live. They're making new messages and they're sharing their reflections on that, whether they're aesthetic reflections in the terms of art or whether that they are textual and utilitarian messages that graphic designers design on web pages and digital devices. These contrast to some extent with classical messages of traditional calligraphers. And I don't say historical or traditional messages because these messages are in some ways, they're timeless. They still apply, but the messages are classical. They are not simply arising from responses to the contemporary condition and the way that the new ideas, the new technologies, the new messages that both the graphic designers and the contemporary artists are responding to. So these, I say, are questions of culture in the trifecta of communication, culture, and technology. Whether the messages that are being shared are classical, historical, you say religious or spiritual, or whether or not they're responding to contemporary culture, or if they're drawing on a longer cultural tradition. And then finally, we have a third axis of text formats and image formats. And here, I'm talking very much about technology and the technological formats and how they are these images, these forms, these different examples of writing are understood by technologies and by computers. Both the calligraphy and the contemporary calligraphic art, if we were to search for them on Google, for example, would come up as image formats, as JPEGs. even though this is meant to be read, it's very difficult to do text searches on this, and optical character recognition, OCR, has difficulty with these traditional calligraphic pieces. So these come up as image formats. That is very different from graphic design works, which come up as text formats. They're text readable, they can be searched as text, and they can be used to do textual typesetting on web pages and documents. Graphic designers are very concerned with the necessity of shaping Arabic for modern media and technology, to have them appear online in ways that can be shared and read by devices and people alike. And also that ability with the need to balance Arabic script alongside Latin characters and other scripts. So then if we take all three of these, here's our three examples again of traditional calligraphy, graphic design, contemporary calligraphic art. We have designed this entire field of writing, where we can ask all sorts of questions about differences in how those forms communicate, the culture and cultural traditions on which those forms are drawing upon and relating to, and the technology and the technological presentation of different objects that are writing, some being actual text and some appearing to our computers as images. So we have this entire field of communication, culture, and technology can be explored and encapsulated through an exploration of Arabic script. Now, I've just talked about those, the apexes, kind of the corners of this, but what's really exciting is that there's also this large space within the field, and most of the products of writing, whether they're by designers or artists or calligraphers, are somewhere in the middle, and they draw upon, they're somewhere between these kind of poles and extremes that I've talked about. So as a final example, I want to look at, present this work, which is a painting by Osman Wahiala. He was a calligrapher as well as a contemporary artist from Sudan. He made this piece, is entitled Yasin. It is, shows the first few verses of the Quranic Surah Yasin. And it's a painting of using oil, ink, and gold on paper. And this is a wonderful example because it kind of goes between all of those poles that I spoke about. It's certainly communicates aesthetically. It is a painting. It's, in that sense, it's contemporary calligraphic art, but it also is referencing this the Quranic Surah Yasin, and it's meant to be at least read or understood, or characters can be recognized by those familiar with the text. So it's also legible in some sense. It is both a classical message drawn upon the Islamic cultural tradition, but it's also framed in a contemporary idiom of painting and contemporary art. And then finally, it is an image. If you search for this, it comes as an image. And the question is, can we also use technology to explore this through as a text? And for that, I will share another project that I did. For that, I designed an interface. Hopefully this will come up. Called Unmixing. We've applied this to both works of contemporary African art as well as contemporary Middle Eastern art, in which we're able to take a image piece, and I've translated or put the text over here that exists, and you're able to unmix elements from the image. So we can take various elements out, we can put them back in, we can take out the backdrop and only see the writing if we wish. So we're able to unmix and remix different elements of this work. You can always go back to the original artwork. And what this allows us to do is to show how this work, which is communicating in a visual and artistic mode of colors and shapes, is also stretching or modifying the letters on which it is based. And if you read art historical studies of this, you'll say that one of the things that Wahiala is doing is he is doing modernist experimentation of the calligraphic tradition. What is meant by that? So for example, let's remove everything except for this, open Bismillah. And we can see this is a traditional calligraphic form, But here we have the nokta for the B that begins it. Here's the bis, and we see these whole verticals from the alifs and the lams here. If we put in the abstract background, we can see again, here's that nokta, and here are those verticals. So he's abstracting the shape of that. Same here with the yasin. We have the ya in blue, 1, 2, 3, and a big swash at the end. In the abstract backdrop, we see the same thing. Here's the 1, 2, 3, and then a swash at the end. So what the unmixing interface allows us to do is take this image, the aesthetic presentation, and interact with it based upon some of the textual elements, other elements, so that visitors, viewers, scholars, and anyone who interacts with it is able to get a sense and understand how the elements are working together to communicate the aesthetic and artistic message. With that, I'll stop sharing my screen. Thank you very much, again, for this opportunity to present this overview of Arabic script and how it's inspired some of my research. And I look forward to an exciting conversation.
Thank you so much, Professor. I'm sure the viewers agree with me that the presentation and this journey you have taken us through Arabic calligraphy is a perfect celebration of Arabic, the UN Arabic Language Day tomorrow. September 18th is the Arabic Language Day recognized by the UN. It started in 1973 when the General Assembly of the United Nations adopted Arabic as the 6th official language of the organization. And it's a beautiful language spoken by more than 290 million people around the world. And we're fortunate that today you gave us more of an artistic overview of this language. So thank you so much, Professor.
You're welcome, thank you.
I would like to start our conversation today, and I'm sure the viewers have a lot of questions, just like myself, by asking you where it all began. How did your interest in Arabic language and Arabic culture in general start? How did it start? And were you exposed to Arabic script or calligraphy before you went into academia? And tell us about how you were introduced to Arabic calligraphy.
Yeah, so I first encountered Arabic calligraphy or became very intrigued by it when I lived in Istanbul shortly after graduating from my undergraduate. I taught English in Istanbul with 2 other colleagues of mine who I think may actually be attending as well, who in Istanbul, we were there, and one of the things that's amazing about Istanbul is the layers of history across the city. So now modern Turkish is written with Latin letters, but then there's Arabic inscriptions all over the city from the Ottoman period, which used Arabic script. And even older than that, there's Greek inscriptions around the city from the Byzantine era. So it became very apparent to me that these signs, these letters that are here, communicate even if you can't read them directly as legible works. They still have a meaning, and that really interested me. And while I was there in Turkey, I started studying both Turkish as well as Arabic. And then I continued that study when I was in graduate school. One of the things that really intrigued me when I was studying the history of communication is that most of the history of communication draws very heavily from a Western and Eurocentric perspective. And as soon as you shift the lens to another culture, whether it's Chinese, whether it's Arabic and Islamic culture, you have a whole different set of questions that arise in adapting languages to printing, adapting languages to computers. And so I was hoping to do a comparative study of that history in the Arabic, with Arabic script in relation to the European tradition of communication. But it all began, I would say, during my stay and teaching in Istanbul.
So I would also want to know Letters of Light. How were you inspired to call your book and your project by this name? I'm sure a lot of people want to know the inspiration behind the name and why you chose it.
Well, yeah, thank you very, very much. It's a something that I am asked frequently, and I don't know when re-looking at the book if I made it as clear in the book as I could, but I think letters of light is a term that encapsulates this entire tradition or that entire field that I was just speaking of. First, that there is a saying or understanding among calligraphy and Islamic thought that letters they do show the light, that they're infused with divine light, so that they are, and through letters we get the light of understanding. So there's this classical connotation to the term, but at the same time there's the digital connotation for when we are looking at our computer screens, as we are all increasingly doing in this time of the pandemic, and we're reading things online. Those letters now that we are seeing are not ink on paper. They're not handwritten ink, and they're not physically printed. These are the letters we are seeing are being broadcast to us as light. The letters that digital screens project light, and then we understand that light as letters, whether they're Latin letters or Arabic letters or characters of other writing systems. So we both now, this classical idea that letters are made of light and share their knowledge through light has in some ways become a material and technological reality through our digital screens.
Yeah, that's amazing. I would like to ask also a question about this kind of notion that people believe that calligraphy is beautiful writing. So from your understanding and your experience, and from what we have learned from Sabah Al-Arbidi, who you mentioned and who we hosted last week for also Expression series, that we learned that Arabic calligraphy is more than simply a beautiful writing. Can you tell us more about that? How do you view that Arabic calligraphy is more than just simply beautiful writing?
Well, first I'll preface by saying calligraphy is beautiful writing, of course. If you look at the tradition of Arabic calligraphy, the written products, the various examples are incredibly beautiful. They're incredibly harmonized. They convey very much to paraphrase Mohammed Zakaria again, as a pattern language. It's the relations between the letters convey not only the message, but also convey on an aesthetic level qualities of harmony, astuteness, fluidity. But the reason that they're able to do this, and this is why I say it's more than beautiful writing, that it's not just somebody decorating decorating the letters in their own personal style. They're able to do this because they are based upon a very specific set of proportions, which is known as al-khat al-mansub, proportioned script. And these proportions, which were formalized in the at least what became the kind of later became the Ottoman tradition, but they were formalized in the 10th century by Vizier Ibn Mukhla as a specific geometry. They're based upon taking if you take the nukta, so the point that we saw that is underneath the ba, then you use the nukta to measure the alif, a certain number of nukta tall, and that the alif is a line segment. I could bring up a screen to show this, but I'll try to talk about it and just talk about it locally. And then from the alif, then you can measure a circle with that alif as the diameter. And with these three measurements, from the point, the line, and the circle, you are able to shape all the other letters. And this is very similar to how graphic design works now. When you start studying graphic design in a contemporary schools, often the first thing you're introduced is to point, line, and plane. That's point, nokta, line, the alif, and the plane, the circle. And so that geometry is able to not just make letters become beautiful, but allow them to be both beautiful and consistent over time. For example, of the consistency that there are samples of Arabic script and Arabic proportion script from the 11th and 12th centuries that are still legible to Arabic readers today, because this science of geometry has been applied so readily. And that's amazing to think of something, almost 10 centuries ago being legible for someone, if you compare it for something with English, where I look at handwriting from about 100 years ago, and it's very difficult for me to decipher. I look at my own handwriting from when I was in college, and I can sometimes not decipher it. So the ability to have that proportion script it didn't just make writing beautiful. It also had other effects, such as making standardizing the writing across a wide range, incredibly wide geographic range in which Islam moved and exchanged ideas, as well as an incredibly long temporal range. Yeah. And I think that that ability of calligraphy to do those, because it standardized the writing, for those who just think of it as beautiful writing, especially I'd say Western communication scholars who just see it as beautiful, don't understand what those were doing technologically and how those helped and shaped a communication practice.
That's fascinating. I have a question about Western cultures influenced by Arabic and Islamic arts. So from Pablo Picasso to Steve Jobs, many Western iconic figures in the arts and design credit how Islamic calligraphy and geometry are a source of inspiration to their exquisite works. Can you tell us more about this Eastern and Western interwoven identity in art today and other examples of Islamic and Arabic influence on Western arts and designs?
Well, I'd say that the interaction, of course, has gone on for generations, and even what I was just discussing with the proportional script. If you look at some of the early studies of letters, or not, I say early studies of letters, but studies of letters that are coming around the Renaissance and the beginning of printing. Albrecht Dürer is a good example, who had the idea, applied the idea of measuring letters by points, right? The nukta is a point. When we start seeing typographic characters coming into use, they're measured by the point size. The point is the point of the pen, which is what the nukta measured as well. So there was this understanding of borrowing letter geometry across the two cultures, and I'll speak more a little bit about the history of communication rather than art. There's been a lot of exchange in art and inspiration, but even in communication, I think another thing that's sometimes missed is the very close interaction between the Islamic world and Europe during the times in which for example, print was arising in the 15th and 16th century. This was also the time at which calligraphy in the Ottoman capital was being revitalized and formalized. So you can see kind of a parallel between type development and calligraphic development as different ways of formalizing writing. And I think that was very fruitful. A lot of the earliest attempts to print Arabic were done in Europe using European models, but yet they weren't always accepted in the Middle East because they did not adhere to the proportional writing system. And so then they had to be redone. And so there's always been a back and forth. And then more recently, I'd say that in kind of digitally, a lot of the issues that needed to be addressed in order to get Arabic to appear properly on screens don't just apply to Arabic. They also have been used for other writing systems. One notable comparison, for example, is mathematics, which, like Arabic, is based upon kind of organizing things around in space much more than a solid writing across the kind of lines of simple lines of writing. So these typesetting techniques that are used in Arabic have also been borrowed for technological development of other scripts. But finally, I'll say one of the things that calligraphy provided artistically is as proportion script, as a set of geometry, it provided an alternative geometry that wasn't just an alternative, but was well developed as a geometric and artistic form. And so when modernists started experimenting with different geometries and breaking perspectival geometry, we always hear about perspective being the kind of the bedrock of kind of Renaissance art and onward. When they started to experiment and try to look at other geometries, here was a system that was an alternative geometry based on letters rather than perspective, and very fully developed. And that's one of the reasons why contemporary calligraphic artists in the Middle East and Islamic artists in general often borrow from the calligraphic tradition, because they're able to then blend and merge these very different geometries.
That's wonderful. We have a question now as we move with our conversation and the evolution of Arabic calligraphy. We also have a question about Western style keyboard influencing Arabic language and Arabic calligraphy. Like, for example, in 2010, 2011, with the Arab Spring and the emergence of using the Western style keyboard and for communication purposes, do you believe that this alternative text style has forever influenced how Arabic speakers communicate on digital platforms? Or is it merely a temporary solution until digital Arabic text becomes more commonplace?
So you're speaking about the phenomenon of Arabizi, which you're using the Latin letters to spell in Arabic. So where the number 3, for example, becomes ayn, and some of them are letters, and some of them are characters or numbers. And yeah, I think this is a wonderful example of both to both highlight kind of technological constraints, but also to show human ingenuity in communication. Right? There's often an understanding that spoken language and written language kind of go hand in hand. They're kind of hermetically sealed, right? And you have English is written with Latin characters, Arabic is written with Arabic script, other languages are written with Arabic script. But the connection between writing and language is much more fluid. We could write English with Arabic writing, with Arabic script. It's not a practice, and it would confuse many people, but we could use Arabic script to show the sounds of English. In the past, Turkish has been written with Arabic script. Now it is written with Latin script. So there's fluidity among the way that the character sets we can use to represent spoken language. And Arabizi is a great example of this. It takes the Latin characters that were available on early cell phones. They did not have a code encoding for Arabic. So they took what was available and used that to represent spoken Arabic. In some ways out of technological necessity, and able to communicate based upon the devices they had. And being creatively applying those constraints. But at the other side, I would say that, so I think Arabizi will continue in that sense. It can be as vibrant as any other writing system. And you even see, for example, online things like LeetSpeak, where people use characters to write in Latin because they're able to kind of have messages that can be searched in different ways or don't appear in certain types of searches. So I think it can still develop. But I think the other thing that it shows why it was necessary during the Arab Spring, and because people were texting on very early cell phones, is it shows how much the digital infrastructure is actually based upon a Latin understanding of writing. That the cell phones that were available at the time did not have support for Arabic script. Now, cell phones and smartphones do, and as I end my book, that's why I talk about the challenges of having Arabic kind of adopted to the Unicode standard, because now you can use our smartphones to represent multiple scripts, but at the time you couldn't. And that was an oversight, but is also a design and technological limitation. So I would say both. I would say it's not necessary anymore, but at the same time, I think Arabizi will persist for those who are unable to afford the latest smartphones, don't have or have early touch, folding phones that only have a limited keyboard, and they'll probably develop in both side by side. And for me, that's really the exciting thing about studying communication, is not necessarily finding the one solution that will always apply, but seeing how humans in our adaptability use the tools we have and whatever technologies we are available and apply them to the different types of messages we want. And if you need to communicate in Arabic and you only have a phone that takes Latin letters, you will find a way to still communicate. And I think that's a great sign of resiliency and human creativity.
Yeah, absolutely. I would like to gauge some of the questions we received from our audience here. What has been one of the findings that has most surprised you in your study of Arabic script?
One of the things that most surprised me, goodness, so much has surprised me. Something that has been the most surprising. That's tricky. I really want to find some very profound answer. I mean, I think one thing that just thinking now on the digital level from Arabic as we were talking, one thing that was very surprising to me with the early attempts to convert or to adapt Arabic and make it function properly on screens and digital devices is that there were a number of challenges for Arabic becoming digital. Since the digital infrastructure was often built on a Latin understanding of writing, it goes the other direction. It goes from right to left rather than left to right. It has a high number of characters because the characters change based upon where they appear, the beginning, middle, end of the words. They're cursive, so it's cursive. There's a large number of variation. It goes from left to right. And these are all, none of these are unique to Arabic, but Arabic may be the only globalized writing system that combines them all in one place. So it became a very particular challenge to address all of those. And a few kind of, now some of those problems have been solved, but one thing that now, when I mention it still surprises some of my colleagues, is just to remember, or just the insight, for example, that Arabic now can be represented from right to left on screen, but still most of the coding and the way that programming languages are written are still go from left to right, the same direction that English goes. So even though you can have native Arabic understanding an Arabic language on the screen, and there still might be some steps necessary before we have native or comfortable Arabic programming that could maybe go in the other direction on screen. And then I guess one of the other things that's just been surprising to me studying Arabic is just the flexibility of the writing system. It has existed for so long, it's been consistent for so long, and it's used in so many different ways. I don't know if there's another writing system that you can think that it's both classical, it's a religious writing system for its direct association with Islam, but yet it's secular. It is the writing system of multiple national, nation states around the world. So it's secular, it's religious, it's classical, it's contemporary, it's still used. It's used for local languages, it's used for global languages. It's a historic language, right? In Arabic is a historic and classic language in the same way Latin is, but yet it's a modern language that's still spoken. So just the flexibility of Arabic language and Arabic script to transcend all these differences and remain consistent over time is both surprising, but then also makes it such a fascinating topic of study because you can see how it's adapted to all these challenges and differences.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a lot of questions now about the evolution of the Arabic calligraphy from the traditional sense to the digital sense, especially with questions focusing on typography and also focusing on the different kind of formats and especially your unmixing interface, and people want to know if it's available for public use. So we would like to know more from your viewpoint also, Professor, if you think Arabic calligraphy can be executed as and mastered as good as if it was done by a human, if it was done by artificial intelligence or a computer or code.
Yeah, that's a heavy question as well. I would, there's a few things about calligraphy. On one sense, I say calligraphy, Arabic calligraphy, even if it is mimicked by an artificial intelligence, will never be the same, because what I think writing does, and especially what calligraphy does, is it communicates not only the message, but also the spirit of the message and the spirit of the person who created it. So there will always, there's that kind of depth of understanding, and I think cultural depth that's encoded in writing. There are a lot of debates about, when I interviewed calligraphers, many of them would say calligraphy is something done by hand. This is also a lot of even contemporary artists now say art is still done by hand if it's painting or something, whereas digital art is something else. And there are the graphic designers who say, well, calligraphy is beautiful, but we don't necessarily need to apply it because now we're dealing in a globalized world. We have different ideas of legibility, different types of messages. So we don't need to have our scripts be classical. When you have other designers saying, no, that we should return to these classical scripts because of their strong geometry and proportions. And one of the projects I will mention is the Decotype project, which is the Advanced Calligraphic Engine. Decotype is a organization based in the Netherlands, but has also worked with, they've worked with a number of countries in the Gulf, and they made the Muscat Mushaf, which is understood as the first fully digitized presentation of the Quran, and with which it went in fully digitized in the sense that it adheres to calligraphic proportions, and it is fully searchable as text. So it is both text and image. And the reason I bring that up is because the Quran is in many ways a test case, at least as Decotype presents it, for merging, if we are going to present Arabic, and especially calligraphic Arabic, accurately on computers. That's a test case because it's such a precise text, and it's a text that requires a specificity of typesetting that isn't present in a number of other texts. So there are efforts to do that. So again, for me, it's more a question of the ways that we are going to keep asking these questions and balancing between them, rather than whether or not we will ever have Arabic completely, calligraphy completely digitized. I will say that the other side of that is, I mentioned OCR, is that because Arabic calligraphy is difficult to scan and have characters recognized, therefore it makes all those calligraphic texts not searchable in the same way that other writings are. So I think making them searchable, being able to transcribe them, is also a necessary task to be undertaken, just so that the contents of calligraphic pieces become equally accessible to online searches as the contents of, for example, printed books do.
We have some questions here, Professor. A lot of people, as I mentioned, are intrigued about your unmixing interface. And people want to know, just like myself, if you have applied the interface to other paintings or other artwork projects, or you plan to do so for other artwork projects.
So yeah, I'm happy to speak about that. The unmixing interface, it was designed now a number of years ago, actually, in Adobe Flash, which, as many know, that has now been phased out. It was replaced. It's been replaced. So what I was showing you is actually now also talk about technological legacies and technological updating is in a kind of a legacy program that doesn't operate very well on touchscreens and smartphones. So one of the things on my kind of to-do list in the future, hopefully I'll start getting to it next year, is to update it and make it more available, that interface available for to be shared online and also be able to be shared as a touchscreen. That said, it has been applied to other paintings. It was actually developed in another research project I was doing. I'm looking at contemporary African art. So we've also applied it to a few African paintings, Congolese paintings. And then we had 3 paintings, 2 African paintings, and 3 African paintings, since the Yasin painting is also, as I said, Osman is Sudanese, which we installed, and we did some tests in the University of California gallery. We've also done some unmixing installations and tested at the Smithsonian Institution to get feedback. So we're still developing and hoping to release it and make it more available. The kind of theory and method of unmixing, the idea behind it, is explored and presented in another book that I wrote, which was published this summer, called African Art Reframed, Reflections and Dialogues on Museum Culture. That's a book I wrote with Benetta Jules Rosette at the University of California, San Diego. And in chapter 6 of that book, we talk about unmixing and explain the idea behind it, as well as what it might offer museums as the future, as a museum technology. And on that regard, the one thing I will say is what really excites me about unmixing is the fact that using digital tools, we're able to change paintings and get a sense on how things come together without having to damage the original work of art, right? That's one of the value added options of digitizing paintings, is that we're able to, if we took the actual painting and started unmixing it, that's a travesty. We're going to be destroying works of art. But if we digitize them in a respectful way and are able to show how it comes together, then we can use digital tools and share them with audiences and viewers to then get a deeper understanding of how the artwork is communicating. And that's the philosophy that inspired that project.
Yeah, absolutely. And with that, we agree with you, Professor, that you mentioned earlier our exhibition Transcendent Text, which is available in our headquarters in Washington, D.C., starting December through May 2021. We intentionally wanted to do an online gallery because we wanted to democratize the art we have, yeah, and also to make it more accessible for people, not just in the United States, but all around the world.
I will also say then, as a plug for any artists or calligraphers who may be listening or attending today, I'm always looking for collaborators and partners who are interested in taking a piece that they've made and translating it or transforming it into an unmixing interface. So if there's any calligraphers or artists who are currently attending, feel free to contact me and we can discuss possible collaborations and ways that unmixing might be useful to you as well.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Maybe we can have a workshop with you, Professor, in the spring.
Oh, I'd love to offer one. It'd be wonderful.
That would be wonderful. We want to know more about your most recent research or book projects and what do you have in store for 2021?
As I said, one of the things I will do is kind of brush off and try to get back into a little bit of programming and design to update the unmixing interface. I think that's long overdue. And then also kind of balancing the work between the African museum book that just came out that I mentioned and more work on Arabic script. There is an article that I am polishing on the Arabic printing, on looking at Ibrahim Mutafarrika, the first Islamic Turkish printer in the Ottoman Empire, who printed an Arabic script, and re-examining him in relation to the calligraphic tradition. That is will hopefully be coming out next year. It's with a project, an edited volume by sponsored by the Center for Manuscript Studies at the University of Hamburg. In that volume as well, there is I'm working with Catherine Schwartz of the University of Massachusetts Amherst, as well as Mahmoud Jabbar, who is a freelance translator and also a Georgetown graduate, to translate a document that by one Mohammed Nadim, who was the director of the Dar al-Kutub printing press in Egypt. It's a short memo on Arabic type and script reform. And what's so exciting about that piece is, in translating it, if we were able to translate it and publish it, is that primary documents on the history of Arabic type are still very difficult to find. They're usually in archives. A lot of them haven't been digitized. A lot of them haven't been translated and shared with a wider audience. So it's very exciting that we have a primary document, which was discovered by Dr. Natalia Soot while she was doing research in Egypt, and that will be able to present the original handwritten memo as well as the Arabic transcription, so it's searchable, and an English translation by a director of a printing press who himself asking these questions of, is it possible to adapt Arabic calligraphic structure to printing? So that's a really exciting translation that we're working on. That's hopefully will also come out, be published next year.
Really exciting, and it's a big question indeed. And I remember you, Professor, mentioning that as part of your book projects, you had interviews with curators and experts from the Museum of Islamic Art in Qatar. And we were very fortunate to have Dr. Julia Ganella a week ago to be part of our Expression series. But I would like to know more about the Museum of Islamic Art involvement, and about also your trip to Doha. I believe that you designed a curriculum for the Communication, Culture, and Technology program for a summer trip to Doha. And I'm sure a lot of people want to know, where does the CCT kind of intersect with Arab and Islamic culture by a trip to Doha? So if you can tell us about your experience and the students' experience also in that trip, I think a lot of people will be really interested to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, certainly. Qatar and Doha are such fascinating places because it's developing very rapidly. It's a very 21st century global city, and it's very vibrant in the way it's tackling questions, I would say, of communication, culture, and technology. So in the museum research, we were able to interview curators and directors of the MIA, the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha as well. And when we organized our the study tour, which was a wonderful opportunity for CCT students. We took about 15 graduate students, master students to Doha, and it was that trip was organized by myself and Mohammed Zayani, who is a faculty member, specialist in Al Jazeera, who works at Georgetown University, Qatar. So we were able to be hosted by Georgetown University, Qatar, which is an education city in Doha. But the idea behind that program, which we designed, was in some ways similar to the philosophy that inspired my book. And I said part of the reason I wanted to write the book was to move away from that heavily European idea of communication history, that Greeks invented vowels, then Gutenberg started printing, and then the Americans and British developed computers, and look at it in a comparative light through Arabic script. And so how we designed that study course was a similar philosophy. It was called Communication and New Media Technologies in the Gulf. Communication and New Media Technologies, Perspectives from the Gulf. And we were able to partner with some wonderful organizations in Doha to look at the question of communication, culture, and technology through the lens of the past, the present, and the future. So first, we were in terms of the past, we were able to work with the museums. The Qatar Museum Authority is building these globally recognized wonderful museums, the Museum of Islamic Art, the Qatari National Museum, in order to preserve and narrate the past in new ways. So we're able to look at how technology was influencing those museum preservations and how it's recording and preserving the past. Then for the present, we were able to work with Al Jazeera, which is of course based in Doha, and their media campus to look at current journalistic practices and the ways that Al Jazeera has also introduced new technologies and new modes that aren't just changing the way regional journalism has happened in the Gulf, but also how that has changed global journalistic practices. So we had that for the present, and then for the future, we partnered with the QCRC, the Qatar Computer Research Center, to look at the ways that digitization and digital technologies can be applied to the specific problems of Qatar and Doha. There's a whole slate of problems because the city has developed so recently and so rapidly that are unique to the region, all the way from down to the infrastructural level of roads and urban planning, up to the personal level of getting Arabic on devices and sharing that. Which are very different in the context and in the Arabic context and the Qatar context than they are, for example, in Silicon Valley. So it's a wonderful there's a wonderful opportunity to introduce our students to a global perspective and a global perspective on the questions of communication, culture, and technology, and how the possibilities of all of those are being explored in Qatar in ways that sometimes challenge, get us to re-examine and reconsider some of the assumptions that we might take for granted if we just focused and remained in the United States.
Wow, that's wonderful. So I think we ran out of time, and I'm sure everyone enjoyed this conversation. I want to thank you, Professor Osborn, for joining us today as part of our Expression series. And I want to thank all our viewers for joining us today and for all the exciting questions that you've asked. We apologize we were not able to answer all your questions, but I'm sure Professor Osborn will always be available and we can answer your questions on our different platforms, if it was on social media or our newsletter. So I would like to invite you to subscribe to our mailing list so you can get more news and more updates from CAKE and from any kind of future events that we might have. I also want to thank all our sponsors for allowing us to have this opportunity to have Professor Osborn and other experts to be part of our programming. And with that, I want to end with thanking and congratulations to Professor Osborn for your new books and your new exciting projects. And also I want to wish our families and our friends in Qatar a happy National Day tomorrow. And I want to wish our friends and our families in the United States and all around the world a happy holiday season and New Year. And we're really excited to host as many programs that are focused on art and culture next year as part of the Qatar U.S. Year of Culture. So hope everyone stay healthy and safe, and we see you next year. Take care.
Shukran. Thank you.